Through a quiet corridor of branching vessels, the heart's own arteries come into view. They run like slender rivers on the surface, then dive into muscle that beats without pause. Each branch delivers oxygen to cells that never take a rest day. The scene is orderly, almost understated. Blood glides, the vessel wall glistens, and supply meets demand with practiced grace. This is where balance matters most. When the rhythm of delivery and need drifts out of tune, fatigue, pain, and injury emerge. Coronary artery disease begins not with drama, but with small shifts in this meeting place between blood and wall. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. Inside, the story turns. The coronary circulation works as a compact logistics system. Arteries widen and narrow from beat to beat. They sense pressure and shear, then release signals to keep flow smooth. The inner lining, the endothelium, acts as a gatekeeper. It allows nutrients to pass, prevents clots from sticking, and makes nitric oxide to keep the vessel relaxed. In health, this layer is thin, slick, and selective. It notices the heart's changing tempo stairs taken two at a time, a burst of fear, a heavy meal, and adjusts delivery in seconds. When this layer tires or falters, the entire system loses finesse. At its core, coronary artery disease is a long negotiation between injury and repair. Low-density lipoprotein, the cholesterol carrier known as LDL, drifts into the wall where it can be trapped and chemically altered. Immune cells arrive to tidy up, but their vigilance can spill into chronic inflammation. Smooth muscle cells migrate and lay down fibrous material, trying to stabilize the area. Over years, a plaque takes shape. Early on, the artery may enlarge outward, hiding the narrowing from view, while the wall thickens silently. The metaphor is a city street with potholes patched again and again. Traffic still moves, but the foundation weakens. A common misunderstanding says the first symptom is always crushing chest pain during a dramatic event. In reality, early disease often gives no warning, or only vague signals like breathlessness during hills or unusual fatigue. Another myth claims that youth or a lean appearance grants immunity. Risk is lower, not absent, and habits and family history still sculpt the vessel wall. The question arises, if change is this quiet, what cues deserve respect before urgency imposes its own? One central conclusion anchors this beginning. Imbalance grows from the inside out, and small, repeated stresses carry more weight than single storms. That makes the opening lens practical. It invites attention to the interface where blood meets endothelium, because that is where prevention and harm both take root. As the eye moves closer to that thin cellular film, its chemistry and vulnerabilities come into focus. The next step follows the first stumbles in signaling, how a once slick lining becomes permissive, and how triggers line up to push the gate ajar. At the microscopic border where blood touches tissue, the endothelium coordinates traffic like a disciplined marshal. When healthy, it senses shear stress, releases nitric oxide to relax smooth muscle, and keeps platelets from clinging. The first stumble in coronary disease is often the loss of this precision. Endothelial cells begin to make less nitric oxide and more constrictor signals. Their surface grows stickier. Their tight junctions loosen. LDL particles that once skimmed past can now slip into the intima and linger. Monocytes notice chemical distress, enter the wall, and differentiate into macrophages that start to ingest the cholesterol cargo. A temporary cleanup becomes a standing operation. Triggers accumulate rather than shout. Tobacco toxins injure the lining directly and foster oxidative stress that modifies LDL, into a more inflammatory form. High blood pressure amplifies the mechanical load, forcing the gatekeeper to operate under constant strain. Elevated LDL raises the number of particles pushing at the door, so more seep through even without overt breach. High glucose, as seen in diabetes, glycosylates proteins and disrupts endothelial signaling. Each factor tips the balance. Together, they rewire the response. The effect resembles a roundabout with one failed yield sign. The flaw is small, but the flow pattern degrades across the entire circle. One practical concept grounds this stage. Dysfunction precedes visible narrowing. The artery can still appear open on a casual look while its biology is already biased toward constriction and inflammation. That is why cold air, a large meal, or sudden exertion can provoke transient spasm or demand-supply mismatch even without a hefty plaque. The wall's tone changes beat to beat, yet the baseline drifts toward stiffness. Over time, more LDL enters than leaves, and macrophages stuffed with lipids become foam cells, the earliest footprint of plaque. A frequent misunderstanding treats cholesterol as a single number detached from time. Risk actually reflects the cumulative exposure of LDL particles and the endothelium's ability to resist their entry. Another misread assumes that clean tests years ago still apply unchanged. Endothelial function is dynamic. It improves with consistent behaviors and worsens with repeated insults. The quiet lesson is that biology tallies habits, not headlines. A brief example keeps the scale human. A commuter lights a morning cigarette, blood pressure bumps with traffic stress, and breakfast is rushed and salty. None of this is catastrophic alone. Together, they nudge the endothelium toward less nitric oxide, more adhesion molecules, and more permeability. The shift is reversible early, but repetition hardens it. The question forms at this junction: how many small tilts does it take before the system settles into a new, less forgiving baseline? The conclusion of this phase is spare and clear. Endothelial dysfunction is the first open door. It converts neutral traffic into a low-grade influx of lipids and cells, seeds foam cells, and sets the tone for later structure. The next step follows the material consequences of that tone: the birth, growth, and fate of the atherosclerotic plaque as it matures from streak to cap, and in vulnerable moments, to rupture. From the first foam cells, the plaque begins a quiet apprenticeship. Lipid-laden macrophages cluster within the intima, forming a pale, fatty streak that needs no visible narrowing to exist. Smooth muscle cells migrate from the media into this zone, switching from contractile to synthetic work. They produce collagen and proteoglycans, weaving a fibrous scaffold that separates the blood from the plaque's core. Calcium salts later settle into this matrix, stiffening the wall. The artery compensates by remodeling outward, preserving the lumen early, so flow still looks acceptable while biology diverges. The core mechanism is a dialogue between accumulation and repair. Lipids gather, cells attempt order, and inflammation keeps the conversation heated. The example that fixes this stage is the fibrous cap. When collagen is thick and orderly, the cap resists stress. When inflammation dominates, enzymes weaken the collagen, and cell death thins the barrier. A thin cap fibroatheroma, rich in soft lipid and sparse in stabilizing fibers, becomes vulnerable. Shear forces peak at the cap's shoulder, the place where structure transitions and stress concentrates. If the cap fissures or ruptures, the blood meets highly thrombogenic contents, and a clot can form within minutes. The event seems sudden, yet its prelude lasts years. The system fails at its weakest seam. The metaphor is a dam holding back a silted reservoir. A calm surface does not reveal the burden beneath. Pressure finds the hairline crack. When sediment piles faster than repairs, one quiet day becomes the day the water chooses a path through the wall. A common misunderstanding says the most dangerous plaques are the biggest ones. Size matters less than composition and cap integrity. Another misread assumes calcification always signals fragility. Dense, layered calcium can indicate an older, more stable lesion, while spotty microcalcifications within a thin cap can amplify local stress. The thread that unites these points is texture, not just thickness. One reflective question rises from this anatomy. If the wall spends years balancing repair and erosion, how often does small stability today mask a rising probability of rupture tomorrow? That question reframes attention toward the biology of the cap rather than the diameter of the lumen alone. The conclusion for this part is precise. Atherosclerosis progresses from fatty streak to organized plaque via smooth muscle migration, collagen build, and episodic inflammation. Vulnerability emerges when the fibrous cap thins and the lipid core softens, bringing the blood into perilous proximity to thrombogenic material. The clinical face of this failure is a sudden thrombus that can choke flow completely. Yet the pathway is modifiable because the same cells that degrade collagen can be quieted, and the same endothelium that lost finesse can regain some of it with fewer insults. The transition to the next part is natural. If plaque biology decides outcomes more than simple size, then the forces that push biology toward vulnerability deserve priority. The lens now narrows to the drivers that accelerate formation and tip the cap toward failure aging signals: LDL burden, glycemic stress, blood pressure load, toxins from smoke, and the patterns of living that tie them together. Risk gathers in patterns, not in isolation. Age adds time for LDL exposure to accumulate in the arterial wall, like layers of paint that never fully dry. Genetics shapes how the liver packages lipoproteins and how vessels respond to stress. High LDL increases the number of particles pressing at the endothelium each hour. Diabetes raises glucose and disrupts nitric oxide signaling while fostering small dense LDL that slips through more easily. Hypertension adds mechanical strain, forcing the wall to endure higher pulsatile loads. Tobacco smoke bathes the endothelium in oxidants and triggers platelets to become more reactive. Each factor works on a different lever, but all tilt biology toward inflammation, cap thinning, and thrombus readiness. A single example connects the abstract to daily life. Consider a middle-aged office worker who carries modestly high LDL, borderline blood pressure, and a family history of early heart disease. He does not smoke, but his sleep is short and erratic. His meals come late and salted, and movement is sporadic. None of these conditions screams emergency, yet the arithmetic of risk is cumulative. Over years, particle burden, pressure spikes, and sympathetic surges from poor sleep converge at the endothelium. The wall adapts, then tires, then remodels. The science at the core is simple enough to keep in view. Risk equals exposure multiplied by vulnerability. Exposure includes the concentration and time of LDL particles and the frequency of blood pressure peaks. Vulnerability reflects the state of the endothelium, the integrity of the fibrous cap, and the balance between inflammatory enzymes and the collagen they digest. When exposure rises while vulnerability is untreated, plaque biology slides toward instability even without dramatic stenosis. That is why two people with the same cholesterol can diverge in outcomes based on blood pressure control, glucose patterns, and toxins in their environment. A brief metaphor clarifies the blend. The artery is a roadbed under traffic. Heavy trucks, LDL load, heat that softens asphalt, inflammation, and repeated freeze-thaw cycles, pressure variability, do more damage together than any one factor alone. Repair crews can keep pace when traffic is lighter or conditions are mild. They fall behind when all stresses stack. A popular misunderstanding reduces risk to a single threshold value good or badass if one test in a quiet season fixed destiny. Another assumes that a lean body or regular gym visits erase family history. These ideas blur the role of lifelong exposure, coexisting factors, and the biology of the cap. The clearer view sees risk as a moving average that responds to the sum of inputs. A question follows naturally. If risk is cumulative and interactive, which few levers move the curve most for a given person? That question invites focus rather than clutter. One conclusion stands. A short list of drivers: LDL burden, glycemic disruption, blood pressure load, tobacco toxins, aging, and inherited traits explains most of the acceleration in coronary disease. The transition is straightforward. With drivers identified, the narrative turns to consequences inside the muscle they supply. How narrowing, spasm, and abrupt thrombosis translate into ischemia, angina, and injury, and how the heart signals distress before and during these events. When blood flow falters, the heart speaks in the language of ischemia. Reduced oxygen delivery slows the machinery inside cardiomyocytes, forcing a shift toward less efficient metabolism and lowering the energy available for contraction and electrical stability. In stable narrowing, the lumen shrinks gradually as plaque and remodeling limit peak flow. During rest, supply may suffice. During exertion, demand rises faster than delivery, and angina appears as pressure, heaviness, or spreading discomfort. In spasm, the artery clamps transiently, even without severe plaque, producing short episodes tied to cold, stress, or nighttime shifts in autonomic tone. In rupture, the calculus changes within minutes. A fissured cap exposes thrombogenic lipids and tissue factor. Platelets collect. A fibrin mesh forms, and the artery may occlude abruptly. Ischemia then becomes infarction as cells downstream begin to die. A single example carries the mechanism into daily time. A person climbs a long flight of stairs after a hurried meal on a cold morning. The heart rate surges, systolic pressure rises, the vessel constricts in the chill, and an already narrowed segment fails to deliver. The mismatch triggers chest pressure that eases within minutes of rest. Days or weeks later, a different episode ends without relief. The occlusion holds. Pain intensifies, and sweating, nausea, or breathlessness join the picture. The biology is continuous, but the outcomes diverge with the speed and completeness of the flow loss. The metaphor is a city served by a single tunnel. Moderate traffic still passes when one lane is blocked, but rush hour exposes the constraint. A sudden rockfall seals the tunnel entirely, and the district behind it dims within minutes. A common misunderstanding treats ischemic pain as the only valid signal. In reality, many, especially women and people with diabetes, present with atypical signs: breathlessness, jaw or back discomfort, unusual fatigue, or nausea. Another myth claims that relief with rest guarantees safety. Stable symptoms still mark compromised flow and future risk, and normal yesterday cannot veto a new rupture today. The biology respects the moment, not the memory. The core concept stays simple. Time is myocardium. Within minutes of complete occlusion, ATP falls, calcium handling derails, and membranes leak. The conduction system grows irritable, paving the way for arrhythmias. As minutes become hours, necrosis consolidates, and the scar that replaces muscle cannot contract. Even non-fatal events reshape the ventricle, stretching and thinning the wall around the infarct and taxing the remaining muscle. This remodeling raises the probability of heart failure, recurrent ischemia, and rhythm disturbances, intertwining today's event with tomorrow's function. A question follows. If symptoms vary and the clock runs fast, how can detection become earlier and action more timely without drowning in false alarms? The answer lies less in heroic single moments and more in awareness of personal patterns, attention to change, and systems that shorten the path from first signal to decisive care. The path forward points to clarity about myths and evidence. The next part addresses frequent misreads: who is at risk, how symptoms present, and why reassuring tests cannot age indefinitely so that understanding aligns with the physiology that governs outcomes. Misreadings follow patterns. One frequent one is the belief that coronary disease announces itself with dramatic, unmistakable pain in the center of the chest. In practice, many first signals are quieter or different in character: shortness of breath during familiar exertion, shoulder or jaw discomfort, unusual fatigue after modest effort, or a sense of "is just not right" that recurs with activity. Another misread confines risk to older men who smoke or carry obvious weight. Women, younger adults with strong family history, and people with diabetes or autoimmune conditions also live within the map of risk, even when outward appearance does not hint at it. The biology does not ask for stereotypes before it lays down lipid, thins a cap, or invites a clot. A second misunderstanding elevates single tests into long-term guarantees. A previously reassuring treadmill study or scan reflects one moment in a moving film. Endothelial function shifts, plaques remodel, and ruptures can emerge in regions that were not troublesome last season. Interpreting normal last time as blanket immunity encourages complacency toward rising LDL exposure, blood pressure variability, or renewed tobacco exposure. Evidence favors the opposite posture. Trends and patterns carry more weight than snapshots. A third misread separates clogging from inflammation as if they were competing explanations. In truth, the two live inside the same process. Lipid entry seeds inflammation. Inflammation weakens collagen. Weakened caps make thrombosis more likely. Treating these threads as rivals hides their union in the wall. The simple mechanism is a loop, not a ladder. One brief example keeps the lesson concrete. A 45-year-old professional, lean and active, notices breathlessness while carrying groceries up 2 flights that used to feel easy. There is no crushing pain, and a memory of a normal checkup 2 years prior floats up as reassurance. Over months, LDL has inched higher, sleep has grown shorter, and stress has become a steady background. The endothelium has less nitric oxide to give. A small, lipid-rich plaque that once sat quietly now carries a thinner cap. The mismatch between self-image and biology widens. The metaphor is a library whose fire alarms are set for roaring flames, but not for the slow smolder in a wall. The building looks pristine until smoke finds a seam, and by the time a sensor trips, damage is already underway. 2 corrective statements help. First, symptoms are varied and deserve attention when they repeat with exertion or escalate from a personal baseline. Second, test results expire. Plans should follow updated numbers and current patterns, not distant certificates of reassurance. These corrections do not promote alarm. They support alignment with the way risk accumulates and expresses itself. A reflective question then arises. If the signals can be quiet and the film keeps moving, what steady habits keep the wall calmer and the cap thicker across years rather than weeks? That question leads naturally from conceptions to principles. The next part distills prevention into a small set of lever-stacking risk over time, building movement into routine days, eating in patterns that lower particle burden and inflammation, tending sleep and stress as vascular inputs, and favoring cleaner air, so that the biology inside the artery meets a friendlier environment. Prevention rests on a few steady levers that shape biology day after day. The first is tracking risk over time. Numbers that govern exposure: LDL, blood pressure, glucose, waist circumference tell a story only when viewed as a trend. A single reading can mislead. A line across months shows drift. When the line bends downward for LDL, and blood pressure, the endothelium faces fewer particles and less mechanical strain. When fasting glucose and sleep patterns stabilize, nitric oxide signaling improves, and the wall becomes less permeable. The concept is simple. What is measured regularly is easier to steer gently. Movement acts as a daily messenger. Rhythmic activity raises shear stress in a way the endothelium likes, prompting more nitric oxide and fewer adhesion signals. Muscles draw in glucose without demanding high insulin, trimming the metabolic push towards small dense LDL. The dose need not be heroic. Brisk walking, cycling to errands, climbing stairs on purpose, and short bouts spread through the day keep the gatekeeper flexible. The metaphor is oiling a hinge. Stiffness yields to small, repeated motions more than to rare, heavy force. Eating patterns set the background chemistry. Meals that emphasize whole plants, legumes, nuts, modest portions of fish, and oils rich in unsaturated fats lower LDL particle burden over time. Salt kept in check helps blood pressure peaks. Highly processed foods, trans fats, and excessive added sugars bias the endothelium toward inflammation and permeability. The aim is not purity, but direction. More fiber and unsaturated fats in most meals, fewer engineered fats and sugars in most weeks. A common misunderstanding says a single superfood can protect the artery regardless of the rest of the plate. Biology answers with arithmetic, not magic. The pattern wins. Sleep and stress hygiene act on the autonomic balance that governs vessel tone. Regular sleep consolidates hormonal rhythms, tempers evening blood pressure, and reduces sympathetic surges that can provoke spasm. Brief, consistent practice quiet breathing. Time in nature. Boundaries on late-night work lower. The baseline tension that the endothelium must ride. Cleaner air choices matter as well. Avoiding tobacco smoke and, where possible, reducing particulate exposure during heavy traffic or fires removes a direct irritant that primes platelets and oxidizes LDL. These inputs are often invisible, yet they move the dial. One example grounds the interplay. A person decides to treat the workday commute as movement, rides a bicycle 2 mornings a week, packs a simple lunch with beans, greens, and olive oil, dims screens an hour earlier most nights, and keeps a note of weekly blood pressure at home. None of this looks grand. Across months, LDL falls, morning pressures ease, and exertion feels lighter. The cap grows thicker not because of a single act, but because the average day became friendlier. A brief correction helps focus. Myths that promise total safety through supplements alone or weekend-only exertion miss the cumulative nature of exposure. Consistency outruns intensity when biology keeps score every hour. A reflective question remains: which small, sustainable changes best fit a given life so that they endure when novelty fades? The transition is natural. With principles set, the final part weaves personal choices with community design streets, food access, air quality, and cultural norms to show how individual risk and public health bend on the same hinge. Meaning emerges where personal choice meets shared design. Coronary disease may begin within a single vessel, yet its arc reflects streets built for cars or for people. Grocery shelves that nudge toward fiber or toward engineered fats, air that carries soot or a salt breeze, and workplaces that grant time for rest or reward exhaustion. The science remains concrete. Population curves move when average LDL exposure falls, when blood pressure variability narrows, and when smoke and particulate matter recede. Individual routines and public policy thus act on the same biology, whether through a home-cooked meal or a clean air standard that lowers oxidative stress in millions of endothelial linings. The metaphor is a river whose level depends on every feeder stream. Each choice is a tributary, and together they set the floodline. Misunderstandings persist. One says that heart risk belongs solely to clinics and cannot be shaped outside them. Another claims that environment matters so much that personal habits are futile. Both miss the interaction. Clinical care, daily patterns, and civic design braid into one rope. Strength comes from the strands together. A practical thread runs through this. Simple defaults matter more than rare heroics. Sidewalks draw steps without speeches. Clearer labels steer plates without lectures. Smoke-free homes protect children before they can choose. A reflective question naturally follows. In any given town or household, which small default could quietly turn the average day into a cardio-protective one? A brief human example ties the strands. A neighborhood adds lighting and crosswalks. A market stocks more legumes and fewer trans fat snacks. A workplace normalizes 12-minute walking breaks mid-morning and afternoon. None of these changes measures as dramatic. Yet in a year, more residents log brisk minutes, systolic peaks soften, and LDL lines bend down by modest but real margins. Ambulance sirens do not tally the lives rerouted, but the wall inside many arteries grows calmer, caps thicken, and episodes that might have erupted never find there today. The conclusion reaches back to the vessel wall and looks forward to the street. Coronary disease is not destiny inscribed in age alone. It is a negotiation between exposure and vulnerability, between the cap's integrity and the storm of daily inputs. The logic is steady and unsurprised. Track what drifts, nudge what can be nudged, and align personal rhythms with environments that make the better choice the easier one. In that alignment, prevention becomes less about willpower and more about design. The closing cadence slows and gathers the whole. A calmer artery is not a miracle. It is the sum of sleep that arrives on time, meals that favor fiber and unsaturated fats, steps taken because the path invites them, air that irritates less, numbers checked often enough to steer them early, and care that treats risk as a moving film rather than a still frame. This story is collective before it is individual, yet it respects each person's day and each community's map. The heart does not read slogans. It responds to averages. When averages improve, futures widen. The invitation is gentle and open-ended. Choose a small lever that can repeat tomorrow, then another that can last the season, And let the cap thicken in the background where no one needs to notice. The difference accumulates where blood meets wall, where lives feel ordinary and quietly safer. This content is for health education only and does not replace personal medical advice. If you have symptoms, please consult a physician.